It's time for the 3-question one for Neuro 16. First question here, what is the initial treatment for ventricular fibrillation? Well, it's going to be CPR, and defibrillation is the big part, so as laid out as the ACLS protocol. The protocol also calls for certain medications, but for step 1, you need to know VFib is a rhythm that needs to be shocked. Next question, what organism is associated with each of the following clues? First one is rabbit hunter. That's going to be Francella tularensis, so if you see rabbits on a test, think of tularemia. Pet prairie dog is going to be Yersinia pestis. I'm not sure how many people have pet prairie dogs. Lymphadenopathy plus a new kitten. That's going to be Bartonella, so that's cat scratch disease. Dog bite is Pasteurella multicida. Next question, what bacterial structure has the following function? First one here, provides rigid support to the bacterial cell and protects against osmotic pressure differences. That's going to be the peptidoglycan layer. Space between the inner and outer cellular membrane in gram-negative bacteria is going to be the periplasm. Mediates adherence to bacteria to the surface of a cell. That's going to be the fimbria or the pili. And then protects against phagocytosis is going to be the capsule. All right, that's going to be it for the world. Let's get to that lecture now.
In this video, we're going to be discussing movement. Whoa! Well, not like that. The two structures we're going to cover in this video are the thalamus and the cerebellum, both of which are pretty complicated and both of which have the potential to be really confusing. But the good news is these aren't tremendously high yield. Movement, of course, involves muscle contraction. And the main initiator of muscle contraction is the motor cortex, which sends a signal down the corticospinal tract to the muscles. But before it gets to the corticospinal tract, that signal has to go through the relay station called the thalamus. The thalamus is made up of lots of distinct nuclei with lots of confusing names. In the study guide, there's a question that asks, what portions of the thalamus relay each of the following types of information? Again, this is not terribly high yield for step 1, maybe 2 stars. But it does show up from time to time, so let's go through these quickly. The first bullet is sensory signals from the body via the medial lemniscus and the spinothalamic tract to the somatosensory cortex. This is the ventral posterolateral nucleus, or the VPL. The VPL receives proprioception and light touch signals from the dorsal columns, because remember the dorsal columns in the spinal cord become the medial lemniscus in the brainstem. And it also receives pain and temperature signals from the spinothalamic tract, and it summates all that information before relaying those sensory signals to the sensory cortex. So those sensory tracts both come together in the VPL. The next bullet is trigeminothalamic and taste signals to the somatosensory cortex. So this is the ventral posteromedial nucleus, or the VPM. So pain and temperature sensation from the face is relayed separately from pain and temperature sensation from the body. And one student suggested that you let VPL stand for very painful legs, and VPM can stand for very painful mouth. The next one says relays visual information from the retina to the visual cortex in the occipital lobe. So this is the lateral geniculate nucleus. The optic tracts basically arise from the lateral geniculate nucleus. And then auditory information is relayed from the inferior colliculus to the primary auditory cortex by way of the medial geniculate nucleus. So visual information goes through the lateral geniculate nucleus, and auditory information goes through the medial geniculate nucleus. Now, lots of students like L for lateral and light for visual info, and then M for medial and music or auditory information. The mammillothalamic tract relays information to the cingulate gyrus via the anterior nucleus, which is part of the limbic system, involved in memory and alertness. Communications with the prefrontal cortex, resulting in memory loss if destroyed. This is the medial dorsal nucleus. But I thought this lecture was about movement. So the dentate nucleus of the cerebellum and the basal ganglia send signals to the motor cortex via the ventral lateral nucleus, which is important for the regulation of movement. And then the basal ganglia send signals to the prefrontal, premotor, and orbital cortices via the ventral anterior nucleus. Again, fewer than half of students are going to be tested on this. So if you mastered everything else, then you can spend some time in the thalamus, but I wouldn't make it a huge priority. Now we're ready to talk about the cerebellum and how it's involved with movement. And again, the cerebellum is complicated and not terribly high yield. So I want to cover this material fairly quickly without getting bogged down in a lot of detail. The cerebellum is involved not in initiating movement, but in fine-tuning and coordinating movement. In your study guide, there's a very abbreviated outline of the flow of information into and out of the cerebellum. The cerebellum receives input from the cerebral cortex and the spinal cord, and those signals go to the cerebellar cortex, and then that sends signals to the deep nuclei of the cerebellum. The deep nuclei are like an integration center for the cerebellum, similar to how the thalamus integrates signals from all over the cerebral cortex. And then the deep nuclei send output signals to the thalamus. We'll cover that output in a moment. But first, the next study guide question asks you to list the deep nuclei of the cerebellum. This is a drawing of the cerebellum cut in cross-section to show the deep nuclei. And our mnemonic for the deep nuclei is fast gerbils exercise daily. We're talking about movement, right? So it kind of fits. Fast gerbils exercise daily. And this stands for the fastigial nucleus, which is the most medial, the globose nucleus, the emboliform nucleus, and the dentate nucleus is the most lateral one. That's the big squiggly looking one. It kind of looks like teeth to me, so think about dentate for teeth. And then sometimes we group the emboliform and globose nuclei together and call them the interposed nuclei because they are interposed or placed between the fastigial and dentate nuclei, which are on the ends. So information flows into the cerebellar cortex, then it goes to the deep nuclei and then out to the thalamus. And where in the thalamus is this information going? To the ventral lateral nucleus, or the VL. We said the VL relays information from the dentate nucleus to the motor cortex. The next question says, what structure provides the major output pathway from the cerebellum? Well, this is the superior cerebellar peduncle, which carries fibers from the deep nuclei out to the ventrolateral nucleus, specifically the contralateral ventrolateral nucleus. So the big question is, which side of the body is the cerebellum influencing? Or on which side of the body would motor control be affected by a lesion of the cerebellum? Well, the point we're making is that the cerebellum affects ipsilateral body structures. Output from the cerebellum goes to the contralateral thalamus, then to the cortex and down the corticospinal tract, and then the corticospinal tract decussates in the medullary pyramids and it controls the contralateral side of the body. So it's a double contralateral. It ends up being ipsilateral. It's kind of like a double negative. For example, output from the left side of the cerebellum is going to go to the right side of the thalamus and then up to the right cortex and down the right corticospinal tract until it decussates in the medulla and it controls the left side of the body. So a left cerebellar lesion could show up as loss of coordination in the left arm. Now we're ready to talk about the organization of the cerebellum. You can look at the anatomical organization of the cerebellum or you can look at the functional organization. Well, let's start with the anatomical organization. Down the middle of the cerebellar cortex is a thin strip called the vermis. Then lateral to the vermis, on either side, are the hemispheres. And deep inside the cerebellum, up against the brainstem, there's a horizontal lobe called the flocculonodular lobe. But on most schematic drawings, like the one in your study guide, the flocculonodular lobe is represented at the bottom. Now, the functional division of the cerebellum is a little bit different. Functionally, each hemisphere is divided into a lateral part and an intermediate part, which is kind of sandwiched between the lateral hemisphere and the vermis on each side. And these intermediate parts are sometimes called the paravermal zones because they are adjacent to the vermis. They're paravermal. The lateral hemispheres are also sometimes called the cerebrocerebellum because they receive inputs from the cerebrum. The vermis and the intermediate hemispheres are lumped together as the spinocerebellum because they receive inputs from the spinal cord, like the spinocerebellar tract. And then the functional name of the flocculonodular lobe is the vestibulocerebellum because it receives input from the vestibular system, the semicircular canals, the vestibular nucleus, and so on. And let's say a word or two about what kind of deficits you would see with various cerebellar lesions. Since the vestibulocerebellum gets input from the vestibular system, you could probably guess that it's involved in balance and equilibrium. So a lesion of the vestibulocerebellum will cause disequilibrium and difficulty maintaining balance, and possibly some truncal ataxia. It can also cause abnormal eye movements, such as nystagmus. The spinocerebellum, which is the more medial parts of the cerebellum, tends to influence the trunk more than the limbs. So a lesion here could cause postural instability. And the upper part of the vermis affects coordination of the legs, so a lesion of the upper vermis can cause a broad-based gait. And then the cerebrocerebellum is the lateral hemispheres, and that tends to control the extremities. So a lesion of the cerebrocerebellum can lead to intention tremor and loss of coordination in voluntary movements. This is why we test for rapid alternating movements, where we have the patient try to flip their hands over on their lap or drum their fingers. They wouldn't be able to do that with a lateral cerebellum lesion. We call that dysdiadochokinesia. I love that word, dysdiadochokinesia. Patients can also have dysmetria, which means they have trouble controlling the distance and speed of a movement. That's why we do the finger-to-nose test, where you have the patient try to hit your finger with their finger. We mentioned that lesions of the cerebrocerebellum can cause intention tremors. Well, let's look at the next study guide question, which says, what's the difference between resting tremor, intention tremor, and essential tremor? Resting tremor is tremor that occurs at rest, but it disappears with voluntary movement. This is often associated with Parkinson's disease, which we're going to talk about in another video. Intention tremor is where there's no tremor at rest. The tremor only appears with voluntary movements. When you intend to move, the tremor kicks in. It's an intention tremor. An intention tremor is associated with damage to the cerebellar hemisphere, to the cerebrocerebellum. And then essential tremor is where you tremor both with movement and at rest. There's usually a family history of tremor, and sometimes we call this a familial tremor. Now the next question says, what are the features of essential tremor or familial tremor? These patients can have rapid, fine tremor of the head, hands, arms, and even the voice. The tremor occurs both with movement and at rest. 50% of patients with essential tremor have a family history of tremor, and we can treat essential tremor with beta blockers, which would be the drug of choice, or with the anticonvulsant primidone, or even with clonazepam in worst case scenarios. But you really don't want to get these patients addicted to benzodiazepines. And patients will sometimes self-medicate their tremor with alcohol because that'll work as well. Now, not all movement disorders stem from cerebellar lesions. Lesions of the basal ganglia can result in hypokinesis and bradykinesia, like we see in Parkinson's disease. And other types of basal ganglia lesions can cause hyperkinesis and chorea. It just depends on which part of the basal ganglia is damaged. For example, if you lesion the subthalamic nucleus, which is part of the basal ganglia, this classically causes hemibolismus, which is an involuntary flailing movement of one arm. So it's hemibolismus. We're going to save the basal ganglia for another lecture. But right now, it's time for the end of session quiz. First question, what kind of information is relayed by each of the following thalamic nuclei? The ventral lateral nucleus relays motor coordination information from the cerebellum to the motor cortex. The ventral posterolateral nucleus, or VPL, relays sensory information from the body to the primary sensory cortex. And the medial geniculate nucleus relays auditory information from the inferior colliculus to the auditory cortex. Remember, M for music. Remember, the lateral geniculate nucleus relays visual information. Next, a patient presents with involuntary flailing movements of one arm. So where's the lesion? That's the subthalamic nucleus. And the last question, what's the difference between essential tremor, resting tremor, and intention tremor? Well, essential tremor occurs both with movement and at rest. Resting tremor occurs at rest and then it disappears with voluntary movement. And intention tremors appear only with voluntary movement. That's it for now. I'll see you next time. Whoa!